Preparing for Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. Hey everyone, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget, I want to talk you through what you're going to need to know in order to be prepared to set up and run with a really cool Active Directory technology known as Federation Services. Synchronize or federate? It's an age-old question. Well, okay, maybe it's not an age-old question, but you ought to be having a little bit of deja vu right now because it's the same question I asked when I introduced Azure AD Connect. And Azure AD Connect was all about synchronization. Azure AD Connect allows you to copy your users from your on-premise Active Directory service up into Office 365, and that way you have a duplication of your users with the exact same passwords up in Office 365, and you can manage those users in both places. But when we talked about that, we also talked about, or at least I mentioned, something called federation, federating users. And federation is a little bit of a different way to capture the same basic process. Federation is all about forwarding authentication requests that come in down to your on-premise Active Directory service. So imagine this. Imagine a user sits down at their desk at the day and signs onto the network on their local Active Directory, right? They type in their username and password. Then they browse to Office 365. Now, what do they want to do? Well, they want to log into Office 365. They go to portal.office.com, they type in their username and password. If you're using Azure AD Connect, Office 365 already knows what their username and password is because it was synchronized up with Azure AD Connect. But you know what would be even nicer? It'd be cool if I didn't even have to retype in my username and password. If I use something called single sign-on, SSO. And with SSO, what happens is this. When I go to portal.office.com, Portal says, hey, do you have a token? Do you have a Kerberos token? And my computer says, well, yes, I do. The user logged on to the Active Directory network this morning. They were granted a Kerberos token. Here it is. Office 365 presents that token to the ADFS server. The ADFS server presents it to Active Directory. Active Directory says, yes, that user is Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com, and gives back a claim indicating such to Office 365. Office 365 says, I know who Ben Finkel at cbtoffice.com is. You are allowed in. And yeah, this seems sort of complicated for me to talk through, but the thing is it happens behind the scenes without any interaction from the user, and it happens at the speed of the internet, so at the most a couple of seconds. You open portal.office.com, the communication between Office 365 and your ADFS server and Active Directory all happens in the background, and boom, it opens up, it logs you in, it knows who you are. You federated authentication out to Active Directory, or using something called Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS. What's cool about using ADFS is, Office 365 is going to work seamlessly with it so that users can have single sign-on into both Office 365 as well as their desktop accounts when they are logging in from the network. But you can also use ADFS with any other service or software out there. So a lot of services are going to know how to integrate with ADFS and are going to be able to set up to trust ADFS so that if you have a third-party service that's, it's how you log your hours for the day, right? You log into a website, and that's where you're going to log your timesheet application. Well, maybe that timesheet application uses ADFS or knows how to use ADFS, and as an administrator, you can set it up to use your ADFS service so that users are single signed on into that application. You're probably developing applications, web applications in-house. You can set those applications up to use ADFS so that they authenticate against your Active Directory server. So ADFS really enables you to extend authentication, your internal Active Directory authentication, outside of your network. And for our purposes, the primary place outside of our network that we're concerned with is, Office 365. We're going to let Office 365 recognize who we are via ADFS. In this nugget, we want to focus our discussion on preparing and setting up for ADFS and integrating with Office 365. So there's a couple of things that we want to talk about. And first, let's just talk about baseline infrastructure. This is probably the most basic thing that we're going to cover here in the nugget, but it is important to understand how you are going to set up the infrastructure for your ADFS server. First of all, you're going to need both, obviously, an Active Directory server. You're also going to need a server running Active Directory Federation services, and these may or may not be the same service. They do not have to be installed at the same time. On a machine, you can have one machine as your domain controller running Active Directory and a separate machine running ADFS that is then looking back to and referencing that domain controller. ADFS is very good about that. Now, alongside your AD and your ADFS server in your on-premise network, you're going to need something called a web application proxy out in the perimeter network, or the DMZ as it's called. Now, this used to be called the ADFS proxy server, but since Windows, I believe 2012 or 2012 R2, it's been known as the web application proxy, the WAP, and I believe you're going to see it in all the documentation and on the exam always referenced as WAP, but if you run into ADFS proxy, just know that it's talking about the exact same thing, the exact same service. And this, as you can see, runs in the perimeter network. This is the service that is going to communicate with, say, Office 365. It will in turn pass back to this. This will in turn pass back to this, and you get the idea. Now, depending on the size of your organization and how many users we're talking about, Microsoft recommends a couple of different topologies, infrastructure topologies. So anything under 1,000 users, you can have a single ADFS server and a single web application proxy. Now, even when it's a single server, they still call it a server farm. Ever since Server 2012, ADFS installations get installed in a server farm, even if it's just one server. So I know farm implies many servers, but even with just a single one, it's known as a farm. So under 1,000 users, yeah, you're good with one ADFS server and one WAP server. Now, when you get above 1,000 users, up to about 15,000 users, Microsoft recommends that you have a 2-server farm for ADFS and 2 WAP servers with load balancing. The load balancer is really important once you have multiple WAP servers, because as communication comes in from the external wider public internet, well, it needs to get balanced across those 2 WAP servers. Now, WAP knows how to communicate with the farm, so you do not need a second internal load balancer here for this communication. WAP already knows how to balance communication across Active Directory Federation Service farm. You only need an external load balancer to handle outside traffic that's coming in from, again, say Office 365. Anything over 15,000 users, up to roughly, I think 60,000 or so is where they stop. You're going to want 3 to 5 ADFS servers in your server farm and still 2 WAP servers with load balancing. So just keep these general numbers, these general thresholds in mind. Obviously, from installation to installation, it's going to change. Your needs will vary depending on how heavily you're using these services. So these are not hard, fast rules. They're just, general guidelines. Once you have your server infrastructure laid out, you want to be prepared to talk about certificate requirements. Yeah, we're talking about authentication requests going out over the public internet. It needs to be secured. We can't just send these things in plain text. We want to hide them behind, well, SSL certificates and encryption. So you're going to need a couple of different certificates installed on your services in order to make this work. Initially, in your on-premise network on your ADFS server, you're going to need a Service Communications Certificate, which is an SSL certificate. And there are a couple of really important rules for this certificate. One, it has to be issued by a trusted third-party certificate authority. If it is not issued by a third-party CA, if you try to issue an internal enterprise certificate, it won't be accepted by Office 365. So you got to go out and buy a certificate. I know, that stinks. 2, it cannot be a wildcard certificate. So as we'll talk about in a second, it's got to be named for the service name. It cannot be a star dot, domain name certificate. 3, you have to have it before you run the ADFS configuration wizard. So while you're running the configuration wizard, you're going to need the certificate and you're going to need the private key for the certificate. So you got to have that all built, requested, issued by the CA and in place prior to running the ADFS configuration wizard to install ADFS. And then lastly, the name of the certificate has to be the ADFS service name. This is going to be different than the computer name that the service is installed on. So you might install ADFS on a server called, DC2715-XYZ. Could be anything, right? But when you configure ADFS, you're going to give it a service name like adfs.cbtnuggets.com. That has to be the SN for that certificate. Now, that same certificate will also need to be used out here in the perimeter on the WAP. Of course, that makes sense because that's the server that is going to be communicating with the broader outside world. So you will need that exact same certificate in both places, both in your on-premise ADFS server as well as in your DMZ on the WAP server. A second certificate that you need is something called a token signing certificate, and this can be created and issued right by Active Directory Federation Services. So that's a lot easier than getting a third-party CA certificate. This is one that you simply create and issue internally, and it's used to sign the tokens that are sent back and forth between these different services. Lastly, we will talk about a couple of network requirements for setting this up, and this applies both to your ADFS services as well as your WAP servers. One, This I think makes sense, but it bears being mentioned. You have to have connectivity between the WAP service and Office 365. So your WAP server has got to be out in your DMZ, and it's got to be able to communicate over TCP over the internet with Office 365. That's how all of this authentication is going to happen. Your service namespace, I just talked about that a second ago. That's going to be on your certificate, right? adfs.cbtnuggets.com or whatever your service namespace is, must be publicly resolvable. You're going to need an A record on your public DNS server that points to the WAP server or points to the load balancer for your WAP servers if you have more than one. So that's really important. Office 365 cannot find your WAP server unless that service has an A record that resolves to the WAP server. Finally, just a couple of features that are worth mentioning. They may come up on the exam, basic questions about them. One, ADFS does support multi-factor authentication through something called the Azure Multi-Factor Authentication Server. If you're unfamiliar with MFA, MFA is simply a secondary authentication factor aside from your username and password that is used to identify a user. So maybe when you go to sign into the service, you also get a text message with a one-time use code on your cell phone, on your SMS device that you need to key in order to sign in. That would be an example of MFA. Maybe you get emailed that one-time code. That would be another example of MFA. So MFA has become really important these days for added security, and it is absolutely supported with ADFS. Also, you can use something in ADFS called claim rules to filter access to Office 365. So with these claim rules, you can actually prevent or deny certain users in your network from signing into Office 365. In a different nugget, when we install and manage our ADFS servers, I'll cover briefly how you can configure these options and where you can set these up. We won't get too in-depth into them, though. So that concludes this nugget on preparing for ADFS, or Active Directory Federation Services. Just to recap, ADFS allows you to federate authentication out to third-party services that are outside your own network, services like Office 365. This in turn enables single sign-on so that users can browse to these applications in their web browser and get automatically signed in without having to rekey in their credentials, their username and password. ADFS relies on two key pieces of infrastructure, the ADFS server and the Web Application Proxy, or WAP server. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.